Welcome to Philosophical Investigations, where we will learn about the language game of Ludwig Wittgenstein. Good day, I am Yala Janica D. Arliana, and together with Finsiki Fatima Quizon, we're going to discuss the philosophical investigation of Ludwig Wittgenstein. Ludwig's famous quote, "Don't ask for the meaning, ask for the use. Use cannot be understood merely by looking at the word. It can only be understood in context." Later on, after our discussion, we will have an idea of how language actually works and how Ludwig Wittgenstein understands language in his own philosophical context. But before we dwell deeper on the content of philosophical investigations, let us first discuss the author of the book. In 1889, Ludwig Wittgenstein was born with a silver spoon in Vienna, Austria. He is considered one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century. After the death of his father, he inherited most of his money. However, he did not make use of it and gave it away to relatives and artists. To him, philosophy was the only work that gave him satisfaction. Although he went to different countries to pursue different careers, his last obsession was with philosophy. He published his first book, Tractatus Logico Philosophicus, which discussed representation, language, and thought. Only a few of those who read his book understand his writings, and even he himself had a hard time understanding what he wrote. He took a break from philosophy and ventured to different activities such as teaching and building the famous Wittgenstein house. Now let us move on to the history of his book, Philosophical Investigations. After his break, he came to a realization that his previous works were dogmatic and he worked hard to be understood better. Thus, the existence of the book, Philosophical Investigations. Ludwig dedicated his life to studying language. In fact, he was not able to finish the book. It was only after his death in 1953 that the book was published. Now let us go on to the actual content of the philosophical investigations. One quote says, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent." This quote encapsulates the whole or the general idea of Ludwig Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations. Its general idea is to help people understand the relationship between the use of language and meaning. It intends to simplify the various things we can do with language. And it also emphasizes that the misuse and unclear knowledge of language might be the major cause of philosophical problems.
Are you saying there are no philosophical problems?
There are the linguistic, mathematical, ethical, logistic, and religious problems, but there are no genuine philosophical problems.
You're trivializing philosophy.
Philosophy is just a byproduct of misunderstanding language.
In the first section of the book, Augustine's idea of language was also discussed. The individual words in language name objects. Sentences are a combination of such names. In this picture of language, we find the roots of the following idea. Every word has a meaning. This meaning is correlated with the word. It is the object for which the word stands. However, Ludwig Wittgenstein also pictured a situation wherein its idea opposes Augustine's view. The situation is as follows. A person is sent to shop. He was given a slip with a mark named 5 red apples. He then takes this to the shopkeeper, and as the shopkeeper reads the slip, he then proceeds to a box labeled with apples. Then he finds a color sample opposite it, which is red. Then he counts from 1 to 5. Ludwig Wittgenstein opposes Augustine's idea of language through this situation pictured, because he believes that the way language is learned in this situation is through ostensive teaching, which is our next topic. In the second section of his book, he described how words are like tools in a toolbox. He pictured a builder and an assistant conversing as they were building something. The words slab, block, pillar, and beam are occurring as they build. By saying the words, the assistant, however, will only be prepared to do an action and not to do the action itself. It is only by the time when the builder constructs a full sentence that will urge the assistant to actually do the action, such as bring me a slab or bring me a beam. The association of words and things is what we call the ostensive method of teaching words. Children would paint a picture in their minds that represents an object, and children learn to practice this process of association as they were taught to obey commands. It is a primitive idea of how language functions. In the context of the use of this and that, children's idea of this is also associated with how an object or a place is pointed out as they utter the word this and that. Every word is linked with an action, thus their understanding of a word. In this primitive idea of language, there is also one thing we call disintegration of the sense. This is when words are not used correctly in relation to their meanings. However, Wittgenstein believes that language is beyond this meaning. Another quote, the meaning of the word is its use. In Wittgenstein's understanding of philosophy, ostensive teaching should not be the only basis of teaching words. There must be a deeper understanding of what a word is. Thus, the meaning of a word should not be limited to its use. Now let us move on to the main event of the book. In his philosophy, he believed in the existence of language games, which describe the existence of the multiplicity of ways in language. It serves different purposes which include making statements, asking questions, making requests, observing phenomena, giving commands, solving problems, and a lot more that carry out actions of communications. The probability of a word having different meanings depending on the individual is high. He states that there exists a number of language games which does not have a general rule for every game. Every game may have different rules, which are subject to change and modifications. In other words, these rules are not constant. A single word branches out to different meanings, even if it is used in different language games. It all varies on the perception and understanding of an individual towards a word. He illustrated words as pieces of chessboard, in which each word has its own different function.
Philosophical puzzles arise because we tend to mix up one language game with another. For example, people puzzle over the nature of something they call the soul. But this may just be because they're thinking of the soul along the lines of a physical object. They're confusing one way of talking with another.
The job of philosophy is to sort out these language games?
Exactly. Well, they're all perfectly in order as they are. Philosophy in no sense can question them. Philosophy leaves everything exactly as it is.
In simpler terms, a language game is just like any other game, in which every game is played differently. Thus, each has its own set of unique rules that must be followed. The same thing goes for language. It may be perceived differently depending on what rules or interpretations or perspectives an individual applies to understand a word. Rules are not fixed in every word. It may vary when the people are already playing the game, thus a modification of the rules. It is also important that one understands the rule of the game before they play, in order to avoid misunderstandings, because it usually results in the failure of the game. It may also be because the words may have unclear or indefinite meanings, or maybe they lack the ability to correlate the meaning of a word and how it must be used. The aim of Ludwig Wittgenstein's philosophy is to set a reminder that a language game may be used with different set of rules. For an efficient language game flow, people must set a fixed game they want to play and rules they want to follow for a meaningful and efficient conversation to result.
Now, let's move on to the next key point. Wittgenstein take on Frege's idea of language. Frege believes that every assertion contains an assumption. He claims that every word is confined to two actions, asserting and entertaining. Wittgenstein is against this idea, as he believes that a word is not limited to only these two, but to different meanings, purposes, and uses. This means that he believes that the multiplicity of language is not fixed, as there are new types of language that are emerging while others are forgotten. This only emphasizes that language is constantly changing and should not be boxed into distinct categories. We can also see the variation of how words are perceived from one person to another. An example would be a couple fighting. The man might say the words, "okay, fine," as a form of willing agreement, as if he's really agreeing to something that the woman said. But the woman may perceive it as a form of forced agreement, like as if he's only agreeing to it because I'm mad. Or if someone says lie, how would you know its meaning without a context? You can perceive it as to lay horizontally in a bed or in a floor, or you can perceive it as to not tell the truth, to lie. See, we can see here that the way words are perceived depends on one person to another. And this might result in a misunderstanding because of the way the words "okay, fine" or the word "lie" was perceived by the both parties. Thus, this highlights the importance of the use of proper punctuation and diction when it comes to the idea of language. Next would be naming. Naming is referred to as attaching a label to something. Like, if you see these pictures on the screen, you can label it as a paintbrush. The next would be a pen. And then the last would be the pencil. But in some instances, attaching labels to words does not automatically give them meaning. It doesn't clarify the meaning of a name. Some examples would be the words water, away, fine, no, hala, wow, ouch. You see, these words do not have a defined meaning, but rather a context. Like when you say water, this could mean a warning rather than you labeling a clear, odorless liquid in the glass. Or the word wow, it could mean and indicate a lot of emotions and words based on the context or the way you use the word wow. You can mean it as something out of excitement, or if you're happy, or it could also be sarcastic as well. So you can see there are a lot of context that comes within a word, which is why it says here that naming doesn't really clarify the meaning of a name. Next would be for the sections of 66 to 71, Wittgenstein introduced the concept of family resemblance. And I quote, "We see a complicated network of similarities, overlapping and crisscrossing. Sometimes overall similarities, sometimes similarities of detail. The same way can we see how similarities crop up and disappear." In here, Wittgenstein emphasizes in this part of his book that languages are related to one another, but they do not possess a single characteristic. Language is likely related to games. There are different kinds of games, like chess, board games, Scrabble, and other games, but all of which have their own set of rules. However, these rules are not set for all types of situations, or like in the context of word Scrabble, there are a lot of different situations that would apply different set of rules. And this can be likened to the word family resemblance as introduced by Wittgenstein. as members of a family may be identified through shared similarities and resemblances. Just like how you might share the same eyes with your mom, or the same eyebrow shape with your dad but different shade of hair, you and your family share a set of similarities and resemblances as well as differences. Your siblings share a wide variety of differences with you. You might share the same nose, but the whole facial structure is nothing alike. And just all the members in the family are not identical with each other. So, also games are not identical with each other. His idea of family resemblance was crucial to his philosophy because he attempted to satisfy our need for generality. The issue of universals was resolved by the idea of family resemblances. One thing that really caught my attention in this book is his idea that, and I quote, if we consider words as particulars, it would be impossible to have knowledge. Next would be Wittgenstein's take on understanding the language. Our criteria for judging whether someone has understood something or is reading something are not dependent on the interior sensations or processes. We determine that a person has understood something based on his or her external actions. An example would be when you ask your friend to do something, let's say to grab something, a glass of water perhaps. So you ask, hey friend, can you pass me that glass of water? So with this, how do we know that your friend understood what you asked of him? We'll be able to identify it through his actions, whether he gets you that glass of water or not, or maybe he gets a different object. This would determine whether or not he understood what you asked. We can see it through the actions. This is what Wittgenstein highlights, the importance of verbal or non-verbal feedback in the process of communication. Now let's move on to philosophy as an experience. Wittgenstein also pointed out in the latter part of the book that the understanding of a term sometimes rely on the past experiences of a person. An example of this would be when we hear that someone is in pain. What's the first thing that comes to our mind? How do we imagine the pain that he's going through? What do we often do to get a grasp of that pain? So for us to comprehend the word pain, we might need to have felt it first. It could be important to think back on our own prior painful experiences in order to imagine another person suffering. We need to tap into our emotions and experiences to get at least an overview of this pain that a person is going through. Through this, we'll be able to contextualize a word through our past experiences. So, in conclusion, language is a vital tool for several aspects of life. It is what keeps everyone connected through understanding by means of communication. Not only it is limited to communication, but also to one's self-expression. But we can see here that language consists of different games. It should not be generalized as there are other factors that play within it. Wittgenstein believes that it is more important to understand how language is used than its abstract meaning when trying to solve philosophical issues and problems. He contends that philosophers must examine common knowledge, common language, and how people utilize it as a tool in a daily life. In this way, a word's meaning has an effect on its context or how it is used in relation to our culture, society, ideas, and our past experiences. To end, I would like to quote this from Wittgenstein. Don't, for heaven's sake, be afraid of talking nonsense, but you must pay attention to your own nonsense.